medals because they were medalers. But I notice on the matter of thallium, he has brought in the foreigners to medal thick and fast. We are on our feet today, and we must resolve not to come off of our feet until the work is done. We must march to final victory. We're calling on them to bring back Gregory Smith to face trial for the murder of Walter Rodney. At the time of the last elections, Hoyt said he could not allow foreign observers because they were meddlers. But I notice on the matter of thallium, he has brought in the foreigners to meddle thick and fast. We have our experience of sickness. We have our experience of the tests at the hospitals. And Mr. Hoyt and the American Embassy are trying to tell us another thing. The American Embassy is the same people who are trying to tell us there were no rigged elections in Guyana. Bear in mind that no free and fair elected government could have behaved on this thallium issue the way the PNC has behaved. No government supported by its own people would be caving into the IMF the way that the Hoyt regime is prepared to cave in. We say, take the IMF out of Guyana. IMF, no way. No way. The workers need more than 1940 a day. 1940 is an insult. Let the TUC get off their knees. Stop begging. Stand up and demand a decent living wage. The cost of staying alive is rising. It is rising out of reach. The children are suffering. Malnutrition is rising. We are saying, let the millionaires wait their turn. Settle the debts with the Guyanese people. Sisters and brothers, the march today is historic mainly for the fact that for the first time in many, many years in our country, the opposition is united. A united opposition representing the vast majority of our people are taking to the streets to demand safety and justice. The united opposition, and you see before you marchers, not of one race, not of one age, marchers of both major races and the other races, marchers of the young, of the old, sisters, brothers, and above all, the working people and the sufferers. This is a march of the sufferers. And as we leave to move on to our business in Kitty, we want to leave with more than we came into this village with. And we want to say on behalf of those of us who have marched from Buxton, that we are extremely grateful for the reception we've received in this freedom-loving village. It moves us that the people of our country, in spite of their suffering and their grievances, in spite of their agonies from morning to night, can turn out in the middle of a Saturday afternoon to welcome people marching for safety and for justice. We are saying to Hoyt, begin a dialogue immediately. It cannot wait. begin a dialogue with the parties of the opposition for electoral reform. Because without electoral reform, without free and fair elections, Guyana is doomed. Thallium, IMF, the dooms will vary, but the doom will be the same. Without freedom, without the right to choose a government, we are doomed in this country. Hoyt must begin. We must force on Hoyt a democratic opening. Bear in mind that people who grew up like Hoyt in the bowels of dictatorship are no lovers of freedom. We must show them that the Guyanese people have not lost their taste for freedom. Today, we are savoring our freedom and we like the taste of it and we need to continue. I want to say finally that our brothers in uniform who have accompanied us all the way from Buxton have been doing an extremely cooperative work. They have been assisting us and assisting the scouts to keep the march in order and to make sure that the traffic is not overly disrupted on the road. And we want these brothers to understand that this march is also a march for them who are not free to march. Today, we march for all. We march for the majority. We march for the sufferers. And we march in righteousness. Onward to Kitty. Oye! 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 We got Thallium. We got Thallium. We got the hill.
When we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all, in no uncertain terms, that this government is disrespectful to black people. And if people disrespect you, you have a right to disrespect them.
I am saying now that we have started, now that we have come together, do not sleep. Don't let us go back quietly into the night. Protest must be the order of the day.
With the haunting sound of David Rudder in the background, and before that, a youthful Dr. Rupert Roopnaraine fired up in June of 1987, speaking at Better Hope in a PCD march from Buxton to Kitty. Yes, it was 36 years ago, but the issues he was speaking about are the same issues we are speaking about today. How time moves on, but sometimes the issues don't follow the time. Good evening and welcome to today's edition of WPA Groundngs, a production of Politics 101. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us from Guyana, and there's some places I want to point out. All those of you who are joining for Georgetown, welcome. From Linden, welcome. From BV, welcome. From Buxton, welcome. From Vreden Hoop, welcome. From Parica, welcome. From New Amsterdam, welcome. From Bridgetown, Barbados, welcome. I named those places in Guyana because earlier today I looked at some of what they call the insights, and I noticed we have some of our largest audiences per night from those places. There are places like Golden Grove, where we also have people coming at us. Lots of people coming at us from Antigua, from Barbados, from Trinidad and Tobago, from St. Lucia, from the Bahamas. Welcome to Politics 101. Of course, a lot of you are joining us from the United States of America, particularly the centers where our people are. I want to shout out to those of you in New York City, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, down there in South Carolina, and the lovely people in Atlanta, Florida. We have a sizable group of people join us from there each night. And my friends who gave me a tongue lashing over the weekend for not mentioning them in Arizona. Big up to all my friends in Arizona who are joining. Nigel and Hubert and all the others from Arizona were joining. A good evening to you, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101. Of course, it is WPA Groundngs, and we're going to be talking to the WPA people this evening. This program is dedicated to the memory of one of their fallen soldiers, Mr. Stanley Humphrey, Mr. WPA, Stanley Humphrey from Linden, who died a couple of days ago. And we are dedicating tonight's program to him. Stanley Humphrey there, along with Ogunse and Brother Blair from BV, WPA stalwarts. Humphrey died in Linden, and we want to dedicate the program to him tonight. What we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about Humphrey himself, but we're going to talk about the role of working people in political parties, especially in the WPA. Most of you would have heard them describe the WPA as a middle-class party, as an intellectual party. But there were so many working people who have been in that party and continue to be in that party. When I joined the WPA, I wasn't middle class. I became a professor in my 30s. By that time, I had been in the party for 20 years or more. And so, even if some of us have now become middle class and intellectuals, we weren't always that. We joined as working class people. And sometimes our parties don't remember the ordinary people, the foot soldiers, like Stanley Humphrey. On the day that he died, I got calls extending condolences from PNC people, from PPP people who remember him in Linden, although he was WPA. And the WPA and the PNC were, quote unquote, arch enemy in those days. He remained on good terms with everyone, a real serious worker type who remained with the WPA until the very end. So we want to talk about those people who we often forget, the salt of the earth, the real working people. I expect a couple of WPA people to join me: Desmond Trotman, Ali Majid, Dr. Nigel Westmas, and Dr. Westmas is here. Let me bring him in. Dr. Westmas, good evening.
Hi, good evening, David.
And of
Thank
course,
you for having me.
When you joined the WPA, you weren't Dr. Westmas either. You weren't
No.
intellectual,
No.
and you weren't middle class, although you were redskin, as we would say, and you were redskin, but certainly not bourgeois, and so forth. Walk us back. I know you and Humphrey had a special bond. I mean, all of us in the WPA had our favorites and so on. But I remember you and Humphrey, you and Stanley. There was something about the two of you, something about you that he admired and something about him that you admired. And I would tag along. And so the three of us were like buddies. And you continued to reach up. And I told the audience last week that when he would see you and I after we became professors, you say, boy, are you coming like bourgeois? No. And, you know, and he would taunt us. But the taunt was never to say that we have forgotten where we come, but it was a reminder, I think. Tell us how you first met Humphrey and how you all became close.
Yeah, well, thank you, David, for having me in. I really sad to hear of his passing. It is indeed true that I had a kind of a special bond with Stanley, but one of your guests tonight even had a more direct link with him, that is Ali Majid. But certainly I knew him at some point. I can't remember exactly at what moment in time that we became close colleagues, but during that time, as you know, people came in mass numbers to the party from all regions and from all races in the 78-79 period. At some point, we always had a Linden batch. And that Linden batch, of course, comprised Stanley. Stanley was, of course, an organizer. He was a blacksmith and a soldier, and also many other areas of Guyana he worked where Ali Majid would probably tell you better of. But certainly he had this way of a very sharp perception. You mentioned his tantalizing and his humor and his ability to to pull us down to the real earth, down with the groundings. But he also was a very sharp observer of political events. He had a very shrewd assessment of people. Again, like you hinted at, it was not malevolent. You'd analyze in the hopes that they would become at one with his idea of what a genial and a cooperative and a groundings persons would be. But he's very sharp in analyzing people. Of all inside the People's National Congress, of course, he had contact with a lot of PNC people at Linden and Wismar, but also members of the PP who were, at one time we were always in some struggle with. And of course, party members themselves, myself and yourself, as you mentioned, when we came back with PhDs, Stanley was very, very unforgiving in the kind of, pulling us down to earth. And he had a very quick wit and very clever way of analyzing where we departed from. In other words, what we didn't say or do, or how we're ignoring aspects of the struggle. So yes, I would agree with you completely that there's another part of the party. At the time when we met with Stanley, the time when we worked with Stanley, there was no sense of being quote unquote bourgeois. We were all in the trenches. I remember you and I had to share fried rice and cut it in half. The same thing with Stanley. When we went to have a wash down after a public meeting, Stanley would be in his element, always observing and making comments and joking with us. And so, yeah, I would say that overall, he's a remarkable human being. He had a lot of no enemies at all. I mean, even those who would dislike him, he had a way of disarming them with his wit. And in part, he was well famous for his sharpness. I mean, Desmond Trotman could tell you about him as well. He and Desmond and I worked sometimes in the office together, and he would give a who is who of behaviors in the party. He knew every activist, and he could analyze them very clinically. I'm talking about from the leadership down to the rank and file. He could give a very good thing. I remember one particular time, he had a very good way of analyzing you, David, when we were in a public campaign and there was some dissension in the ranks, and you offered to let our good friend, who's now a pastor on the West Coast, what's his name again? Norman Dalrymple, yes. You gave him the vehicle to drive.
The
Yes.
long walk. The
long walk. As soon as you gave him the directive thing, he said that the dissension ceased and Dalrymple went over to your side. And he was very critical. You see how David meeting Norma were in unity, not to rebel, and David, who is in charge of one aspect of the long walk, give Dalrymple the vehicle, and Dalrymple loved to drive, and that was the partnership breakup, right? So that element is what he was like. And I said before, Ali Majid knows him better from his Linden side, and on the Wisma side, he always had a very good community. People like Frank Fife and others. Walter Rodney, there's a picture I put on Facebook.
Franny.
Yeah, Franny, Kwesi, Franny and him were like tick and thieves. Stanley and Franny would always come down together. So they were like twins and so of representatives from Linden. And so they became famous and also became close to a number of us. And at some point, I just gelled with Stanley. He had a way of dealing with things that was very, very remarkable. And I think he had a human instinct, which is kind of, if you don't know him very well, you wouldn't understand how sharp he was.
Yeah, and he was a bauxite worker. He worked in the bauxite industry. And I remember when I first made contact with him in the late 70s, he was fiercely loyal to Walter Rodney. I mean, he was part of that cadre of men and women from Linden that Rodney drew to him. And he was fiercely loyal to Walter, and not in a worshiping way, but he
not a starry-eyed way.
Yeah. He had a really keen sense. And in this picture, here is Walter speaking to bauxite workers, and there is Stanley with his shirt open, with his folded hand, and this is Walter. The workers would get off from work at the bauxite company, and Walter would be at the bauxite gate with the WPA and others. All of us were there. And the workers will come from work and come straight to the public meetings. And Stanley was part of that group that Walter was able to connect with. Talk about the way in which the working people like Stanley, Humphrey, how Walter was able to connect with them in a way. Here is this big international scholar, but he was able to connect with those working people from all over Guyana, but in Linden in particular. Talk about it.
Yeah, well, that speaks more about Walter Rodney's international capacity. Even of course, in Guyana, he came back. But wherever Walter Rodney went, he has a way of dealing with ordinary working people and labor workers and community leaders and Rastafari in Jamaica, as you know. And he had a very, very charismatic way of handling people and dealing with them, even though he's, of course, the epitome of intellectual quality. He managed to ground with people very, very early. So he became famous for the term grounding. So I was not surprised that Stanley and Afrani and Cedric Smith and other bauxite workers and others who were left, as you say, left work, would come straight to hear Walter Rodney speak. He had a magical way of talking to people about their problems. So they would be listening to him as Walter Rodney, but they would be hearing issues about the bauxite plant, about the conditions of labor, about their capacity, about their ability to mobilize, about their strength. And he's giving them hope and giving them advice and also taking criticism. That is one thing I think that made him great, that Walter Rodney could take criticism. He knew that he didn't put a comment on community and say, I know everything. He would talk to people like Stanley and glean very sharply what is actually going on. And so I was not surprised that you said that Gelden and Stanley I knew that Stanley was a very strong proponent all the way up to recently when I last spoke with him. He's always talking about Wally. He doesn't call him Walt, he said Wally. Right, wow. And the reason why is because Wally was close to a number of bauxite workers, including himself. Yeah. I remember one time when I repeated this before, but one time I was on a mission. I was just asked to come in the car, driven Olga Bone's car, Bonita Harris's mom, and we drove up to Linden. Well, I was driving in the front seat with another woman who was supposed to be acting as my mother, and we stopped at the toll gates, and Walter Rodney was in the back seat as a bauxite as a carpenter. He had a saw. He was sleeping. We went to Linden. We stopped two checkpoints. We passed it because he pretended to sleep as he reached there. But after that, he would just get off with us But we stopped there and we went to a WPA meeting, the first one, when I arrived, and Stanley was among them who met with us, and we had a meeting of WPA Linden. And then Walter Rodney left again to another meeting, which I didn't know anything about, another kind of level, and I didn't know that particular part, but I was there with him, and we came back the same way. So, and Stanley was all in that mix up, and Franny and Cedric Smith, and Frank Fife and others. Frank Fife was never formally part of the WPA, but he was in the spirit of a very strong supporter of Walter Rodney as well, because he had that independence. Linden is a very independent place historically. A very strong independent streak. So I'm not surprised that they galvanized to Rodney, because he himself, Rodney, was not a dogmatist in any form or fashion in terms of ideology. And so he would have immediately gelled with those workers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nigel Westmus, longtime WPA stalwart. Nigel, you came into to the WPA, and you were going to classes at Walter's Bottom House. At the same time, we were having, and these were quote unquote political classes. We in Buxton were having classes in Guyana's flat. And what we didn't know at the time is that Guyana and Clive Thomas and Rodney would travel up to Linden and hold the same classes with Stanley and them. So it was the public meetings, but it was also the quote-unquote semi-formal learning of politics. So here, Westmus in South, David Hines in Buxton, and Stanley Humphrey and others at Linden. And we didn't know that we were being prepared, if you will, not just to be activists out there, but to learn politics and history and economics and so forth. Talk about that experience.
Yeah. Well, as I said, my first entry into the party, WPA, was my father, of course, as you know, was formerly Dr. Jagan's secretary. So we were in the movement, generally speaking, but I always had an independent streak. I never formally joined the other organization, but I was there loose, as an individual in the city. I didn't go to UG at the time because those were, tough days. But one day, Bonita Harris asked me to come to classes at South Ramville. So we took a minibus, went to the class, and then there when I met, saw Walter Rodney in classroom. So I still have a syllabus notes from some of his classes. He talked about Marxism. He talked about Guyanese history. He talked about a whole set of issues, the environment, the cocas, that kind of areas. The classes continued for a couple of weeks. I can't remember exactly when they ended, but as you just correctly said, there are contiguous classes going on, which I didn't know about. I knew of UC Guyana, but I didn't know him directly, so I wasn't in Buxton that often. And so at Linden, certainly I didn't know the classes were going on as well. So, but you were correct in saying that there are complementary of all of these education in struggle and different formats. It might take on a different tinge in Buxton, or it may take on a different tinge in Linden. The one I went to was a mixture of working class and middle class folks. So there's a certain trajectory in which Walter spoke. And unfortunately, those were not recorded, but I do have notes from one of them. I do have the syllabus of one of those presentations. But you're right, there was a simultaneous attempt to educate working class people, to galvanize them, not only in terms of struggle, but generally speaking. That was Walter's modus. That was Guyana's modus. That was Clive Thomas and others' mode. They were always talking to people and educating them irrespective of where they would go. Not to force them into any party. There was never that kind of situation in the party. It was just the sake of mobilizing you, educating you to understand history, understanding the politics, understanding Africa, understanding the dynamics of class relations in the region, and of course, understanding Marxism, as Rodney was always talking about Marxism as well.
Dr. Westmus, let's go back to Stanley Humphrey and Linden, because this is very important. Obviously, Linden would have shaped Humphrey and shaped a whole set of people who came out from Linden. Even before the WPA, Askria as a historian, you would know, had an important role in Linden. And then once the WPA was formed, Linden became one of the places that they paid particular attention to. Why? Why Linden?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to know if is Ali Majid on?
No, it's not on. Neither
Okay.
Ali, neither Ali nor Desmond.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because he knows Stanley better than I would in terms of the concrete conditions in Linden. But certainly, as you know, Linden was always from the whenever the bauxite companies, Alcan and others, went into that area, there was always a labor movement in Linden that always in the struggle against the plantocracy, sometimes the white ownership of those subsidiary, those capitalist enterprises, and the working class, the mine workers union and others, and then an independent section of that, the Organization of Working People. Now I understand from Ali Majid that Stanley was never directly involved in the OWP, but he had, of course, linkages with them and such, because he couldn't be in that community and not know of the Organization of Working People, or know of the struggles, or know of all the problems that the people face. So Stanley was part and parcel of that great element in the working class independent. You hinted at it, we had hinted at it earlier, that Linden had a particular peculiar quality. Burnham was, when the Lindeners felt that Forbes Burnham was not listening to them, they would invite Cheddy Jagan, or they would have some a strike, or they'd form the OWP, which is distinct from the government-controlled union. And so that was the kind of environment which Stanley Humphrey grew up. And so when Walter Rodney hit Linden, or when the WPA worked at Linden, there's an automatic gravitation to party, because it had WPA, unlike other political parties, was not hierarchical in the sense of an ideological perspective. It was very open to people. As you hinted at the start of the show, it had more working class people than any other quote-unquote middle-class folks. Yes, there were those, but there's also large numbers of working-class people from the Sugar Belt, from West Coast Demerara, from Linden, from the West Coast Berbice, from all parts of the country, in Berbice, East Coast, of course, galvanized into the party. And so those meetings of workers brought together across unions. For example, the Bauxite and Walter Rodney and others in the party were very instrumental in sharing ideas about how to go forward with both sets of working people, the sugar workers and the bauxite workers. And one of the images you put up on the screen earlier, with Stanley sitting next to Amir Mohammed and Clive Thomas, was a meeting actually with GAU.
Yes, and Dennis Von Cook.
And Dennis Von Cook, yes, who was an overseas party supporter. They were meeting with the GAU there. One of the times when the bauxite workers and the party's influence in trying to bring those folks together was very active, and that was an element of it. So I think Clive was representing University of Guyana Workers Union. Amir had links to the West Coast, of course, and Stanley, of course, was representing Linden in that image. So he was very central in those discussions, and his insight into the conditions of the working people also led us to, in Dakelin, to put out, I remember in 1992 or 1985 period, he would give insights into what was going on, and Guyana and others would publish in Dakelin the conditions of the working people at Linden, the nuances, the cost of living, the problems with the union, GMW, or the tensions against the owners of the bauxite, even the nationalized, both the earlier private one, and then, of course, the nationalized element of Guy Mine, right? There was always tension in that. So Stanley was very strong in that.
Yeah, and you know, Nigel, I'm glad we're having this discussion for a couple of reasons. I think some people malicious, some people very innocently, who describe the WP as a middle-class intellectual party, is really insulting the working people who were stauncher members of that party than some of us, you know? And it's an insult to them to describe a party that they helped to build as some middle-class intellectual joint. It's an insult to them, but it's also an insult to our younger people who were not alive at that time and so did not have a sense of party formations during that time. All parties had middle class people. I think some of the other parties had more middle class people than we did in the WPA. I take the intellectual thing because the left-wing intellectuals were in the WPA. There were other intellectuals in other parties. But what the WPA represented, and I want you to comment on this, is that mix of working class elements, intellectuals, and a sprinkling of the traditional middle class. And there were ways in which struggle brought us together in one place, and many regards has kept us together decades later. Speak to that.
Yeah, I think it has something to do with political culture, precisely because of that gelding between different disparate elements of society. What WPA didn't have that other parties had, well, certainly the People's Progressive Party was a strong business support element. So even if you want to call it middle class or even higher class or whatever, but we never had that element. So we had the classical middle class, intellectual sections of that in the party, coming from a different perspective of the new left and new world of the 1960s into independence and into the post-republic era. But we never had a strong financial backers in the sense of a Maseralis and we didn't have a Gimpex, we didn't have those elements in the People's National Congress who had ties with strong elements in Guyana and all of those big companies. So that was one element I could say that definitely we didn't have a strong economic base. But as you correctly pointed out, we did have a way of dealing with problems which distinguish us from the other parties. And so, for example, in terms of the working class, Walter Rodney was, of course, a strong element in that. But when we had meetings, it was very strong very strong indication that all of the party orientation outwards, if you look really Decline carefully, from 1974 when it first started, all the way up to 1992, you would consistently see a pro-working class configuration in Decline, the content, almost 75% full working class issues, whether it's women in the market, the cost of living, whether it's Guy mine strikes, whether it's sugar workers striking, whether it's the struggle against free and fair elections, whether it's the struggle for general press freedom. Decline would include that working class element in it. And it was also driven by people who kept coming into the office. So when I entered the office, for example, as a office manager in the very early period in 79, when I was at the counter with Mobutu Kamara, the majority of people who would come in there were not, as people now say in terms of hindsight, middle class intellectuals. No, it was the blood of the earth, the working class, with people like Bisun Rajkumar from Grove, Parakeet from Borabis, Mohammed Brothers and others from West Coast Babis, Lady Stein, Upper Borabis, Victoria, Buxton, of course, and all down East Coast, Plaisance, either teachers, working class people, all of them were influx into the office. Yes, there were middle class elements.
And your boss at the office was Ohini Kwama, remember?
Yes, my boss is Ohini Kwama. He was the center coordinator par excellence. He was the man in charge of managing the money at the counter. And myself and Mobutu just sat there. When he was assassinated, we took over in some of the functions, but he was in the main chat. And then we had, of course, people like Adeshina, who was always in the office. He was hands money, could do anything with his hands. And you had all of the other people coming in.
Brian Rodway was the man.
Brian Rodway, artist, supreme teacher, but then also a very, very down-to-earth person. I mean, as you'd mentioned, as outside of the program, you call red men, red people. I'd always have association with middle class. But if you know Brian Rodway was, you take a findie in a rum shop, and come out and then create a wonderful art, but would cuss up, as normal to everybody and get drunk. And, he was always that like very talking, always educating people as well. And so we had a very melange of people, and the majority of it, 75 to 80%, were mainly working class. So you're right. This notion that of middle class parties is a new invention, a regurgitated notion of the classic assessment of parties across the region, which are subsumed by the middle class correctly within a correct assessment. But in the concept part, WPA was never that absolute control as they tried to maintain. It was mainly run by working people. And if you look at you see Guyana, he was a teacher, and he was never, in terms of quote unquote middle class associations, you could never accuse Guyana of being middle class in any form or fashion. And he was centrally involved. And Moses Bagwan, you're centrally involved in meeting people at the comment, and the people who Guyana would be meeting were always working class people. Market woman complained, and he would take down notes, and then he would pass it to the counter. And when people come to the counter, we were always made sure we are extremely polite and accommodating. We've never had we open the door right away and let them come in. There's no checking of security, and we haven't any security. I think the check, people just walked in and met Guyana, met Brian Rodway, met others, and others. And so those people would come in and do work and edit. And so Bonita Harris and people were usually accused of being middle class, but they were not the direct engine of the party in those days. And way into the... And another point I should make too is that there's another notion which is very false, that when Walter Rodney came back, when Walter Rodney, the WPA died or disappeared. That was never true. They actually, as you know, the groups began to grow more after 1982. And we had such an expansion of the party that in 1985, Hoyt made a statement saying, Desmond Hoyt, that we must contain the WPA. You don't contain something which is diminished. And so that was the element in which groups were formed all through. I mentioned Bisun Rajkumar. We had groups in Grove. We had groups in Georgetown. I was in Prashad Nagar group and Kitty. We had other groups in several groups in Kitty. Takuma Gunse, of course, another working class firebrand of those days, taking on the police. Karate. Actually, a lot of people don't know that Walter Rodney trained Lyndon Ellison, also trained Walter Rodney in karate. In self-defense. Takuma Ogunse trained Walter Rodney. He was a black belt or close to that, and he was. I remember him in the Tiger Bay, going through the motions with katas and so. And Walter Rodney was there in his gi, his white gi, and Walter was doing the stuff under Takuma Ogunse's tutelage. So again, a working class element is in charge of the great Walter Rodney in terms of one aspect of self-defense. That is karate. So I agree with you in the notion to contest this notion, which is usually bandied about, of its overwhelming notion of a middle class party. But Stanley Humphrey, to his credit, of course, was also very good at if you dare to step out of the line in terms of taking on, as you know, bourgeois attitudes, Stanley would be the fiercest critic and the greatest tantalizer you could imagine in terms of those potential. You bring back a book or something like that, and to somebody who asks for a book, Stanley would say, "Oh, so you're bringing back books for Kidaki, but where is my book?" So he has that way of saying, "You're only bringing for these big shot boys, the teacher boys. What about me?" Right? So he had that way of dealing with people, and which brought you down to earth right away. And I think that's why I gelled with him more than anybody else in terms of that. One of the closest friends I had in the party.
Yeah, I played an excerpt from a speech that Dr. Rupnarine gave at Better Hope in 1987. And Rupnarine is another pillar of the WPA. And he's been chastised every day these days for saying some time ago that he felt more comfortable in Linden than he felt in a place like Port Morant. And of course, it's a brave statement to make. And I have seen Stanley deal with Rupert, because unlike a Walter or a Clive, who come from working class families. Walter's father was a tailor. I think Clive's dad, or Morris Odler, they did work on the waterfront, but they came from working class. Rupert came from an Indian middle class family, and I was always amazed at how Stanley dealt with him. Talk about that, because you would have observed it.
Well, Stanley dealt with people. I mean, I can't relate some of the ways in which he would analyze people, but Stanley, he admired Rupert. He really admired him because of, he said this, this. He would say it in his own inimitable way. This is Coolie boy coming up, to Linden, and
he's a brave
boy, man. He's come and he's talk. I don't see anybody like that doing that kind of stuff. You'd come there and he could talk. And you think he got his little bourgeois ways, but he's good at. So Stanley had that way of dealing with all of the Indo-Guyanese comrades in the party. Moses Bagwan, for example, always very, very genial with Stanley, and vice versa. And others who, and of course, Bisun Rajkumar, salt of the earth, Mudaz Rajkumar, his sister, were very earlier PUP, very strong PUP supporters, but joined the WPA, and they became very central in the party's education and labor system. And Stanley was among those who would often meet when we had conferences with a wide cross section of people. But Rupert was very good at of going to areas, and I think he made a true statement in how he actually felt, and he felt very comfortable at Linden because he felt secure there. Because the multiracial element in the party that innervated the activists was in itself a security. I don't know how to explain better than that, but it was always clear that you'd be protected whatever happens, because we were always all one. No Indo-Guyanese person who goes to Linden would ever feel isolated, or would always feel cherished, And of course, Rupert being an intellectual, going to Linden was always you always could come back refreshed. You would always talk about this at meetings. I went to Linden, I came back very refreshed. He and Walter would go to Linden as well. So there was always that kind of very close connections with the Linden comrades. But Ali Majid, I said, unfortunately, is not on tonight. He could tell you more accurately and much more from the ground upwards about how Stanley operated in that, because Ali Majid was also from Linden. And he lived there for a long time, and he was also part of the struggles up there, the working class struggles with the people, and he was there at the time of Walter as well. So Ali Majid, unfortunately, is not here, but he could tell you much more, in a much more illuminating way, about how Stanley operated and who was his contacts in Linden, what he meant to Linden, and what he meant to the party.
Another aspect of the experience in the party, with the mix of these classes and people from various parts of the country and so forth, was dealing with the women, the Andayes and Bonitas and Jocelyn, although she wasn't a party member, but she was there all the time, and Karen D'Souza, and that you and I know that we feared Andaye because of our sharp edges as young men in the 1970s, and she had a way of pulling you in line. But there was something in a kind of unique, I would watch you and I recoil in fear if we said something that we felt was not politically correct, and I heard. But Stanley seemed not to be fazed by it. Explain that.
Well, because I think Stanley knew he had a self-confidence in his belief system. He wouldn't take it, and he didn't. I don't think he would venture. He would say, "Oh, we are intellectuals, so we are transmitting something to Andai," which he would respond to us because we're not grouping. But Stanley was working class, and he felt immune from those kinds of assessments of gender and other issues that have to do with language of the clean or what we say in politically incorrect. Stanley and others wouldn't, as you said, correctly point out, wouldn't work. But not only Andai, but Stanley was had also a very strong way of not being fearful of Guyana, for example.
Oh
You
yes,
know,
oh yes.
yes, he wasn't. He
What's
wouldn't have
wrong?
that kind of. He did. You know, he had the respect, of course. Everybody very respectful of, you see, Guyana, but Stanley had a way of, he didn't respond. You would let Guyana override him in that certain way. You know, he would be very without being nobody was kind of gruff, but it would be a way of carving out independence without even saying so. And
Right.
Stanley was great at that. You know, he would think, but you would joke about it too. He would talk about when he went up to Guyana with Brentnell Holder.
Yes.
We used to call him
Hudson Austin. General
Hudson
Hudson Austin.
Hudson Austin. Well, Hudson Austin
During the
and
time of the
Stanley.
Grenadian Revolution, he said, "Oh, brother Rupert and brother Guyana, if you all become like Cord and Bishop, I will have to be a General
Hudson
Austin."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, Stanley and Hudson Austin or Brentnell Holder went to Buxton to meet with Guyana. And Stanley said that when they arrived at the door, of course, you see, asked them to take off their shoes. Hudson Austin was going in with his sandals and he had to stop. But he said when Brentnell picked up a picture on the table and held up and said, "What do you see? Is this you?" "I didn't give you permission to pick that up." That's what you said. and Stanley said, even though he wasn't at the bunt of the criticism, he felt more embarrassed than you see himself. I mean, than Holder, and then for he felt more embarrassed than Brentnell Holder because he was there with him. He said that Brentnell jumped into the man's house and picked up pictures and asked him questions. So that was Stanley, and you talk about this story over and over again about the Brentnell case, but also the case with you and Dalrymple and other cases too, and you assess people. I remember him assessing all of the political leaders apart from the party. As I said, the one he had less criticism for is Walter Rodney, Wally. But he made assessments of all the political leaders in the country from Hyde to.
Tell you what, Nigel, we have Ali Majid here. He finally.
Okay, great. I'm glad.
Ali, good evening.
Hi, good evening.
And although we are all party members, we have to give you our sympathy because you and Stanley were real buddies. In fact, you're the one who broke the news to us that he passed away last week. You were in daily contact with him. How you met Stanley and what was that friendship like that lasted all these decades?
Okay, you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. Pops made a good point to start to say that I first interacted with Stanley around 1975, and that would have been at one Walter classes as was alluded to earlier by Nigel. This very first met him, but we had a very loose kind of relationship. But myself and Stanley, without collaboration by us, we had similar paths in many areas. One, well, we were both employed by the company. We were both members of the GNW. We were both shop stewards and branch officials in the CNT branch, which is the clerical and technical branch, and the industrial branch, which is the largest branch. And by virtue of being a shop steward, you would have to make representation. Stanley being Stanley and being in what we call the machine shop and the plate shop, where the noise could be very high, very high. You got to speak at a level that you could be heard. So Stanley used to speak to be heard in that kind of environment. Yes, he would speak to be heard. And he made a lot of representation, but I got to take you back. Stanley joined the company in 1960. I joined in 1972. Stanley had a lot of activism before 1970. He had a lot of activism, and it wasn't easy then. It wasn't easy then. Okay, but going on from where we were, shop steward and branch officials, we had participated in almost all the main struggles there were in Linden, whether it's whatever strike there was, in whatever type of industrial strike. And well, you know, our activity led us on to the food strike, as we call it in 1983. You may recall that the food strike led to a large protest, and the cause workers had decided that they're going to strike
Yes.
1 day per week. 1 day per week.
This was after a worker whose name was Leach catch bad feelings one morning, and then you all down tools.
Yes,
and then
it was part of it.
began to strike once a week. Yes.
Yeah, and the company retaliated by cutting the work week to 3 days per week. But we said no, we can determine how we work on that kind of stuff. So the strike prolonged that kind of for a long time. But it culminated with both myself and Stanley, among other union officials, like 50 something, being retrenched in 1983. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were retrenched. But continue myself and Stanley, both of us at different times without, as I said, collaborating, joined the WPA. We were members, joined the WPA. And we became executive members of the WPA at different times. But we are there for perhaps like 20 years, 20 plus years as EXCO members. So those are the parts that we have gone through. Also, we were both RDC councillors, Stanley in Region 10 and I in Region 4. By virtue of being RDC councillors, we would exchange ideas, discuss different things happening in different councils and in different communities. But the thing with Stanley up there, he was virtually a one-person opposition, so to speak, even within the same group that had him as part of the ticket. Why? Because Stanley had opposed what he seemed to be improper procurement practices, and he had challenged it. He would tell the chairman of the RDC, whoever the person would be at the time, and he would speak out. Stanley was so convinced and had his own convictions that he would reach agreement with councillors to discuss approaches. But Stanley would say, when you go to the meeting, they stay quiet. Stanley nevertheless would stand up. He, being in a minority of one, it wasn't his problem.
Ali?
Yes.
I want to pose this question to you, Ali. He seemed to have frozen there. Are you hearing me, Ali?
Yeah, I'm hearing you.
Yeah, I want to pose this question to you, because here were people like yourself and Stanley who were and continue to be working class to the bone. Not like Nigel and me, who left the working class and become professors and so on. You all were working class from the beginning to the end. And here you all were in a party that did have some of the top intellectuals, did have some middle class people. Did you all feel out of place in that kind of family? Talk about how you all managed in a party like that.
Well, I would think that, let me speak for myself, and I would think perhaps Stanley too, but I would think that being in the company was a great, added help to us to learn and understand. Nigel had spoke earlier about Walter classes. Those classes infused in us a lot of knowledge and a lot of conviction of where we are as working class people. So we saw those brothers, Walter, Clive, Rupert, and all those we would call intellectuals, as person there who would pass on knowledge to you. They were not people who sitting there and talking above your head. We were in a room talking, and we all understood what it was about. So we could have leveled, we could always get our point of view over. So no, I was never intimidated at any time in those positions. I think with the same with Stanley, and as Nigel would tell you, Stanley would tell you, he got to tell you. He would describe everybody and the kind of stuff there. So Stanley had a problem either.
Yes, he was not intimidated by anybody in the party. He would not, as I said, suffer fools easily. Brothers, a fascinating discussion, and I think these kinds of discussions are important in terms of passing on, especially to the younger people. What it's like to be in a political party. These days, people walk off the streets and walk in to the executive of parties and didn't go through the ranks. Both you, Nigel and Majid, Mondays were special days at the WPA office because that was day clean and open ward day. And you will have the bassoons, the Blairs and the Holders, the Chan, the Stanleys, and the vendors all meeting up in the WPA office on a Monday. Nigel, talk about Monday in the WPA office.
Well, yeah, those are great days. Nostalgic because, as you correctly point out, everybody who came collect material. So Linden, Herman Holder was the biggest, by far the biggest circulator of papers. He had a big swat from BV all the way through. So he would there, Chan from Buxton, selling Buxton, and others too would be there, the Rimple, the whole set of them would come in the office. So you had a banter, you had excitement, you had exchange of information, you had cuss outs because the day clean is not printed properly or late, or you had tension between some of the cadres, but all in good spirit in the sense of all parties have that. But it was always a generative thing. You felt that there's something is happening because day clean day and Monday we're going to spread it out like what they call when the one of the cricketers, John Arlett, said when Clive Lloyd arrived at the wicket, fieldsmen are being sent like missionaries to far places. well, you had that in WPA, that these people would collect and then they would go like missionaries to all parts of the country with day clean to sell, and then come back and account for it on Friday or whenever, and bring back and if there are any leftovers, very few, and also talk about their encounters, right? Whether dogs or so you had that kind of very, as Ali would know, very convivial way, tantalized, joking, energy. It was really remarkable. And just in a small office, when we moved to Kroll Street, the same thing. You had that energy of people coming to pick up papers. But I'm talking about Tiger Bay, in the heart of the working class area of Georgetown, where people would come from all parts of the country to collect newspapers. And Brian Rodway would be printing too. And if you make the mistake of putting them in, not in hundreds, but in straight lines like that, you'd get what Brian Rodway's tongue. I remember getting cussed out one time because we put them straight ways and he took a long while to print them out and, parcel them off and we put them together and it was a big story, It was really great days. Yeah.
Ali Majid, how do you want to remember your friend and colleague, Stanley Humphrey?
Well, I want to remember him as someone who stood up, someone who has shown conviction, someone who was able to represent workers, someone who, regardless of what his circumstance is, look, this is wrong, and you got to defend it. Stanley is a person who we say as we say, had him. Stanley, he's living in London like for 63 years. What I would wish is if what Stanley has or could somehow be imbued in the community of Linden, because certainly the kind of fight that Stanley would have demonstrated, singly at times, many is not seen it at all in the community. So if at least arising out of Stanley, that is that the people of Linden could be able to look back at his life and look at his contributions and say, well, if this man can do this, and do it for such a long period of time, at least I can try and bring some kind of semblance of respectability to us as a people. You see, the people at Linden there, there's lost a kind of fight. The fight that was within them, when we were there during the 70s and different periods. It was a real kind of.
We seem to have lost Ali there. Nigel,
I'm here. I'm hearing you.
Okay, Nigel, put Stanley in a larger cultural context. CLR James talks about the ordinary man, bondsman. He drink up and cuss up, and then he put on his white clothes on Sunday morning with a bat in his hand, and he became a wizard. He became a magician. Talk about the Stanley Humphreys, who didn't have the degrees and the name recognition, but without them, we who are better known would not be this known. Put him in that larger cultural Indian context.
Well, Ali Majid put it correctly. Stanley had an independent streak and a fighting streak, which was remarkable. And I mean, that's why so many people liked him and galvanized, because he never suffered any fool, even in the bauxite, even among the very people he's struggling with, he would make very critical remarks. But I remember him fondly for his quick wit and his sharp way of demobilizing fears of the other, and also making a critique at the same time. In other words, you would make a critique, and you wouldn't. It would be in such good humor that you feel disarmed, and that is a rare quality that I don't think even some great politicians have. And that is why I think he galvanized towards Walter Rodney, because he could analyze. As Majid quite correctly pointed out, he knew the shop floor, he knew Linden, he knew the guiles of the people in charge, the managers. He knew the weakness of the workers around him, and he knew the weakness of the system. But he also knew that there was always hope, and he would translate that into always wishing for that period of time. In other words, he would reflect on the great days and always looking forward to the future. And I remember him that way, even to the last, because I know one of his friends, Jarek Rutherford, who he stayed at in New Jersey, posted on Facebook. He agreed completely with it. I remember Keith Scott, not a WPA member who went to NFA. He also talked about the ways maybe we'd go in the car with him, how Stanley would pull us down. With Keith especially, you'd pull Keith down in a very very way, very skillful. But what you don't going back to the independent working class. I would call him a working class intellectual without the intellectual tag. He understood people very, very well. And Ali could bear me out. He could analyze how you walk, how you talk, and he could see through falsity. And that was the greatness about Stanley Humphrey Collins.
Stanley Humphrey Collins. Ali, when is the funeral?
Well, they are waiting another daughter to come in the country, and I will get the date maybe pops tomorrow. Right. But the funeral is on Saturday, but I don't have the detail as in terms of the time and the church. It will be on Zoom. I will get the details later and send it out.
Ali Majid, Nigel Westmus, WPA stalwarts here tonight. Talking about their brother, comrade, Stanley Humphrey, who passed away this past week. Long-standing members of the WPA, reflecting on Stanley and in true WPA style, using the death of the brother to speak about the larger struggle and to speak about a moment in history that perhaps some would argue was definitive in our post-colonial journey. I want to thank you all, brothers, for coming on, and on behalf of Politics 101, express our sympathy, our condolences to the family, and relatives of Stanley Humphrey and the people of Linden, because he came from New Amsterdam, but he was a real Linden man and known by one and all. Thank you all very much for coming through, Nigel and Ali. And to you, our audience, I want to say thank you, as always, for sticking with us. We come in peace, we live in peace. Tonight, we talk about an unheralded hero, one whose name is not a household name in the larger Guyana, but whose contributions are very much integral to the household that we call Guyana. Good night, and tomorrow I will be here at the same time for us to continue our conversation, because this indeed is a conversation. Until tomorrow.
When we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all, in no uncertain terms, that this government is disrespectful to black people. And if people disrespect you, you have a right to disrespect them.
I am saying now that we have started, now that we have come together, do not sleep. Don't let us go back quietly into the night.